2 decades ago, I edited a Macmillan book on ethnic challenges and the modern state. It came out about 18 years ago. Its current exorbitant price in Amazon does not necessarily attest to its quality, but it does to my interest in the subject, both as a historian and in my political persona. Today, in a totally different context from 2 decades ago, the multiple phases of the nationalist backlash are back. So this talk is about the different manifestations of the phenomenon. I will not overlook, of course, the Israeli case. To warn you that some of the quotations from pertaining to the case of Russia are taken from notes that I took at a dinner with Vladimir Putin 3 years ago in Sochi as a part of a major conference that they put together, the Russians. Now, Israel's much vilified nation-state law does not make her unique in her drive to a homogeneous identity. Clannishness, as it turned out, is natural to human social life, only that the recent outbreak of nativisms suggests a potent reaction to the perceived failures of the liberal order with its globalized, borderless system. Ernest Gellner was a great scholar of nationalism. He claimed that nationalism is a strictly political creation. But I think that this underestimates the mythological roots, the weight of common history, memory, religion, language, in some, the collective genius which Herder saw expressed in legends, myth, and cathedrals. It is the encounter between culture and politics that make a nation. And when a component, be it politics of culture or culture, is missing, it is sometimes invented. To wildly paraphrase Ernest Renan, a famous political philosopher, French political philosopher, one could say that a nation is a group of people that lie collectively about their past. And too often rewritten to suit the needs of the present. If Samson was a Hebrew hero, then I was told by the Palestinian ambassador at the UN, then his nemesis Delilah was Palestinian. So it might be true, as Israeli historian Shlomo Zand explained in his quite bestseller book, The Invention of the Jewish People, that Jews do not represent a continuous genealogy dating back to ancient times, but nor are other nations. Biological entities perhaps are human beings, but not nations as a collective entity. They are normally invented communities, mixed and fluid. There is not much consanguinity in nations. Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, was overly optimistic when he defined globalization, our age, as the age of post-national identity. Look how optimistic he was. For it also represents a powerful backlash, globalization, of national identities and tribal loyalties. The tension between cultural ethnic distinctiveness and the integrative tendencies represent today a very serious legitimacy crisis in the West, throughout the entire West. However we refer to it, whether it is a communal system of messages, or the nostalgia for a lost paradise, or the regional nationalisms in contemporary Europe these days, the case of the 1,000 faces of group identities has left almost no state and no region of the world immune to its attractions. This can also be found these days in the mushrooming of museums related to local identities and history. These have never enjoyed such a boom throughout Europe. Experts speak of a memory boom. This is also the case of historical studies known in France as lieux de mémoire, that is sites of memory, of national memory. The late historian Eric Hobsbawm defined the 20th century as the age of extremes, in which state socialism led to the Gulag, liberal capitalism to cyclical periods of depression, and nationalism to the hecatomb of 2 world wars. History may not repeat itself, but as seemingly Mark Twain said, it frequently rhymes. The connected vessels of economic depression and rampant nationalism is again tearing apart societies, raising protectionist walls, also in this country, and feeding conflict. In Europe, Hungarian, Polish, English, and Italian nationalisms are rising up against the very fabric of the European Union and the confederal values underlying the European Union. National borders are back. Voters' fear of economic insecurity, immigration, and open borders have massively eroded the support in Europe for the Schengen system of open borders. In America, the Trumpian anti-identity tide that helped move white nationalism from being a fringe movement to center stage gets these days intellectual tailwind from liberals such as Mark Lilla and Francis Fukuyama. Multiculturalism and the international cooperation, they say, became a liberal elite fantasy divorced of national identity. It made white voters in this country, according to them, act as a disadvantaged group under an existential threat of becoming a minority in their own country. Defining the rise of white nationalism chiefly as a backlash against the liberals' obsession with identity politics and their positive discrimination of marginalized groups, as both Lilla and Fukuyama claim, to me doesn't sound too convincing, although I do not hold myself as a great expert on the United States. Both anti-immigrant nativism and the guilt complex of cosmopolitan liberals in this country and elsewhere for the sins of the West in faraway lands have a pedigree that long preceded the rise of multiculturalism. I refer you to the book, an extraordinary book by Paul Hollander, written about 30 years ago, on political pilgrimage of liberals to third world countries in a sense of self-flagellation. It is the economy, in my view, of faltering globalization that is the equation's central component. The colossal inequalities, the unsatiable greed, obscene concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, who have siphoned upward the fruits of innovation and tax benefits, and the stagnating status, if not decline, of masses of left behind are the combustible of rising populism and ultranationalism. No other than the OECD leader, Angel Gurrea, he's the chief of the Organization of Advanced Economies in the world, who spoke of the capture of politics by vested interest and defined the era of globalization as the era of winner take all. Thomas Piketty was a great French economist, wrote bestseller in economic studies, Capitalism in the 21st Century. He has shown to what a staggering degree inequality has grown in the last 200 centuries. In his home country, France, he says positive change occurred only under violent eruptions from below. The system was never capable of correcting its own deficiencies. An elite of pseudo-reformers, the Davos crowd, for example, as he explained, as Piketty explained in his 2015 Nelson Mandela conference, does in effect perpetuate the system. The mass gravitation of nationalisms in some places to hyper-nationalism and exclusion, resentful exclusion against globalization is a call for the state to recover the power it had lost to the big, borderless multinational corporations. Power has shifted away from the nation state, and governments are not equipped anymore to meet the challenges of our times. Starting from the changing population pyramid and what it means for the pension system, to mass migration, from the social effects of automation to climate change, and from cyber security to mortal illnesses. This outsourcing of sovereignty by the states recalls how in the 17th century, the English and Dutch East India companies built their own private commercial empires. In his 1908 novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, G.K. Chesterton denounced the idiotic idea, I quote him, the idiotic idea that if anarchy came, it would come from the poor. They have more stake in the states than the rich, he said. Aristocrats were always anarchists. Today's obsession of the super rich with philanthropy, rather than paying taxes for the state to spend it, is a form of anarchy. So 2008, in many ways, rhymes with 1929 in terms of economic, or in terms of the effect of a big economic shift. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist that had such a huge influence on America's New Deal, on Roosevelt's New Deal, he's warning that political extremism is the child of bad economics. I think his view was vindicated as Europe's recent decade of austerity ate away at the basis of the welfare state and pushed people to the arms of populists. Germany's obsession with austerity as the antidote to the repetition of her 1930s experience of inflation as the avenue to dictatorship eventually backfired. It became, together with immigration, the battle cry of populist and authoritarian promoters of ultranationalism and xenophobia. Mass migration driven by failing states, local wars, and climate change. I refer you to the last, I don't know if it is his last book, because he writes a book every 6 months, Timothy Snyder. His book is a Yale University historian. He wrote a book about the link between the Holocaust and the Holocaust of climate change. With its concomitant desertification and loss of livelihood, is bound to become a persistent phenomenon of our times. And the West will continue being its main destination. The tormenting dilemma of democracies today is to turn the downtrodden immigrants or handing ammunition to the far right. It's the dilemma. Either you absorb them or you give ammunition to the far right and to the ultras of different colors. If you look at the European Union, Europe is an empire, but one that was built on democratic consensus. In that sense, it's quite a precedent, because you ask the free will of the members of the EU if they want to be members of the EU. Now, the EU has never been truly about the end of the nation state. It was about turning nationalism into a benign force of transnational cooperation. But the objective of inoculating Europe from the maladies of nationalist narcissism that was written into the DNA of the European Union was gravely undermined by the disarray of the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the austerity measures that followed. Communal bonds can withstand economic strain, but they dissolve when shared values are trampled and the sense of belonging is lost. Europe's economic deceptions are compounded by the collective inability to create what, of all people, an Englishman, Winston Churchill, once called a European family. He called for a European family, linked by what he called patriotism and common citizenship. It didn't happen. The American dream, for example, you guys might think it is in crisis, perhaps it is, but it still remains in this country a sort of collective ethos. The European project, however, has failed to inculcate a similar organizing vision capable to prevent a sharp economic downturn from resuscitating the nostalgia for a strong authoritarian state. Ethnic nationalism is essentially an East European phenomenon. It sprang from an environment where subjugated nations liberated themselves through a return to old ethnic roots. Blood and religion, not citizenship, was what defined the nation. But after the ravages of World War II, East European nations recovered their sovereign nationhood through the greatest ethnic cleansing in modern history. Europe's integration then failed to resuscitate Mitteleuropa fin de siècle, multi-ethnic dream. Instead, it revived the 1930s ghost of xenophobia and ultranationalism. Germany's Alternative für Deutschland is not a fringe phenomenon. It is a socially mainstream mass party that rejects Germany's apology for her Hitlerian past. Angela Merkel's enlightened policies could still be the last breath of Germany's politics of guilt. Neighboring Austria has never admitted guilt. Chancellor Sebastian Kurz's far-right anti-immigration coalition is poised to end EU's politics of identity annihilation, as he put it. Western Europe was supposed to be immune to ethnic nationalism. In the modern nation state in the West was shaped around civic, not ethnic categories. The educational system was the factory of the citizen, and the nation was defined as a community of citizens. You probably know the book by Simon Schama on the French Revolution. The title is Citizen. This is what matters in West European nationalism, particularly obviously France, which is the nation state par excellence. Neighboring Austria, the educational system was then the factory of citizenship. Race, color, and gender were not to be an obstacle. You could define perhaps that kind of nationalism with a term that might be, I guess, familiar to American citizens, that is constitutional patriotism. What unites the nation is rights and obligations through the Constitution. The rise of radical ethnic nationalism then is a defeat of Europe to its eastern neighbors. They were absorbed into the EU on the assumption that they will become a nation of citizens, but it is going the other way around. another difference between the West and the East is religion. The West Europeans don't look for religion as their mark of identity, whereas the East is much more religious. Oddly, this is what separates also Europe from godly America. This is a country where religion matters. It doesn't matter so much today in Western Europe. Now, the flame of ethnic nationalism has also caught in immigrant-friendly moral superpowers like Sweden and Denmark. The rise of the far-right Danish People's Party and Sweden Democrats with roots that go back to Swedish fascism and the keep Sweden Swedish nostalgia for the mythic white Sweden of the 1950s. Another thing that we are seeing all over, I guess including in this country, is how in the 1930s the political center was diluted in a polarizing shift to the extremes. Even before Trump, moderate Republicans were becoming a dispensable minority. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn's radical Labour faces a Tory party that is held hostage by its Brexiteer extremists. In Italy, an odd coalition of right-wing and left-wing populists united forces to destroy the old centrist political forces. Alternative für Deutschland in Germany has become the main voice of the opposition in parliament. They deride the mainstream press or the mainstream media as Lügenpresse, fake press, or the lying press, a term that was used by the Nazis in the 1920s. In the recent elections in Bavaria and Hesse, voters abandoned Angela Merkel's center in droves. This substantive generational shift away from the old established parties undermines Germany's capacity to remain the bulwark of united Europe. With Merkel and her likes gone, the specter of a fascist-like figure one day ruling Germany suddenly does not look that far-fetched. Rising international infighting and infringement on liberties is no longer rare. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair's anti-terror laws, and in this country the Patriot Act with George W. Bush, enacted after the 2005 Al-Qaeda suicide bombings in London, make Blair the first Western leader to have repudiated what British philosopher John Gray called hyper-liberalism. Today, John Gray pretends to launder Brexit's outburst of nativism with the unconvincing claim that compared to the continent's return to a dark European past, Brexit still makes Britain the last refuge for liberal nationalism. As we saw in Yugoslavia, Cyprus, Czechoslovakia, and other places, and we are being taught now by the lessons of the Arab revolts, a multi-ethnic or multi-religious society can become a recipe for the implosion of the state. It happened in Czechoslovakia, it happened in Yugoslavia, it happened in Cyprus, and it happened throughout the entire Arab geography. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had, of course, much to do with the collapse of the multinational structure of its empire. Okay, this is a struggle the West is not immune from either, as we see by the rising challenge of regional nationalism. Regional territorial identity in the past used to be the hallmark of backward societies. Look at the south of Italy, the Mezzogiorno. There is a fantastic book written by Carlo Levi during the days of fascism. Christ stopped at Eboli. That's a very interesting book about the rejection of the destitute, or rather the wholly destitute south of the central Italian state. But today, we see it differently. Today, it is the more developed regions that aspire to disengage from a central state that supposedly sucks their resources to support other backward regions. Quebec, Scotland, and Catalonia represent a new brand of extravagant nationalism that, which I defined in an article I published on this as the nationalism of the non-oppressed nations. Because they are not oppressed nations. I mean, they do not need to be liberated. Regional nationalist groups in Western democracies are not subjugated people, and they can expect the most generous devolution possible to protect their singular legacies and address their grievances. Nobody should be surprised, therefore, that the three movements eventually ran out of steam. In the past, communities achieved statehood in a struggle against colonial rule, galvanized by an appeal to history, memory, ethnic affinities. A better economic system or more efficient administration has never been the cri de coeur of independence. For independence, it doesn't really justify independence. Here you had it somewhat, no taxation without representation was an economic argument, but behind it there was obviously a very strong sense of something new that was being created. Now, invariably nations marched united to independence. Catalonia is now almost evenly divided against itself in a manner that it had not been since the Civil War. It was precisely a similar, profound internal division that doomed Quebec's and Scotland's bid for independence. Those who are familiar, they are more familiar than I am with American history, know that even the Confederate leaders in the American Civil War understood that without a unified people fully behind the bid of independence of their slave republic, the movement was doomed. But the politics of secession can indeed reach absurd dimensions. An unofficial poll recently in Venice has shown not only that 89% of residents in Italy's northern Repubblica Veneta back independence. 89%, it's amazing. Now the Venetians' desire to secede from the poorer south might sound familiar to other regions that feel that they are financing other feckless regions. Now the assertion of national identity, and this is what comes from this dinner with Putin, the assertion of national identity around a moral narrative is not confined to the West. George Kennan claimed in his 1947 Foreign Affairs article that Russia's hostility to the United States was written into the genetic code of the Soviet Union is applicable to a degree to the current collision between the West and Russia. For the West, the prospects of peace with Russia are still determined by whether Russia looks for a place in the Western orbit or clings to the traditional values shaping Russian civilization, namely Orthodox Christianity, the authoritarian tradition, a grand literary and cultural tradition, and the ethos of a mighty country proud of the vastness of her geography. But I think that Putinism cannot be reduced to sheer lust for power. Sheer lust for power doesn't work anymore. It has to rest on an alternative idea. By drawing from Russia's Cold War defeat the need to extol the non-Western depth of Russian history, Putin extols the same conservative values of Russian orthodoxy and the common Russian that Tolstoy's War and Peace idealized as being the reaction to the Napoleonic invasion. That is, he goes back to 1812, to the defeat of Napoleon's Grand Armée. This is the sense of humiliation that brought back to life the essence of Russian culture and civilization, and that of the common man, as Tolstoy saw it. The only unconvincing part with regard to Tolstoy is that there is much French in the text. That is, there is much French in the text, which obviously the common man didn't speak in Russia. Now, the attempt to civilize Russia from abroad, Putin told us in that meeting, is primitive borrowing. It is the disruption of traditions and the consonance of history. This is the way his translator put it. I don't know if these were in Russian exactly his definitions. His claims to be the defender of traditional family values against, and I quote, genderless and fruitless tolerance, which is a euphemism for gay rights. Russia might not be anymore a global superpower, but she pretends to have a morally superior claim with regard to American international recklessness. But what we see, well, that this moral sense of superiority is very characteristic of most nationalisms. And this pontifical kind of discourse is mired in contradictions. Because not only has Russia become a kleptocracy governed by an anarcho-capitalist elite, it is also a kaleidoscope of ethnicities and cultures which Putin defines as ethnic mafias. This is his expression. Moreover, the Western values Putin dismisses are precisely those that the sizable segments of Russia's population that are exposed to global trends aspire to endorse. So Putin might not, after all, represent a departure from Russia's century-old drive to be treated as a great power in a world order that always saw in terms of Hobbesian competition. Let me address now briefly the case of Jews and Israel in particular. Modern Jewish nationalism is a category of its own. It certainly is the most emblematic case of identity detached from history, for it was kept alive by a nation of diaspora, whose living space was for millennia the entire planet. History, memory, ethnic and religious solidarity mattered no less for the definition of Jewish identity than the longing to a distant territory. As a nation of diaspora, the Jews have traditionally suffered from nationalist narcissism, which is what made them embrace universal ideologies. But the normalization of Jewish existence, they finally realized, could only be expressed through national self-determination. Anti-Semitism turned out to be the driving force of Zionism. The Jewish ethnic identity turned into an assertive brand of secular nationalism only through the return to a territory and the struggle for it against another people. But 70 years after its creation, secular, progressive, even utopian Israeliness has been drawn back to its Jewish roots. Advanced, as almost everything that one can say in this kind of conferences, it is a generalization. So it was, I think, Oscar Wilde who said that the difference between civilization and barbarity is the nuance. So we need to be aware that one might sin with generalizations. But I think the major trends, I addressed the major trends. An advanced economy with one of the major levels of inequality among OECD countries, Israel's drift to ethnic nationalism has more to do, however, with her being the territorial expression of the traditional Jewish fear and existential anguish than with the dilemmas of socio-economic disparities. Israel's far right inherited the Jewish tendency of facing the world. We historically have a problem with the world. We're the only country that faces the entire world when she has a dilemma. The world is an amorphous and almost meta-historical figure with whom the Jews have a dispute pending that cannot be resolved through the traditional tools of international relations. It made the Holocaust into the constituent myth of the Zionist Israeli narrative and drew its ideology of power from the depth of Jewish experience, their absolute guiltlessness, and the eternal unforgivable hostility of the Gentile world. Metaphorically, I would divide the Israeli national psyche between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, two metaphors. Tel Aviv is the modern evolution of an Israel that embraces the culture of secularism, hedonism, and economic growth. Tel Aviv believes in the state of Israel as a legal entity opposed to Jerusalem's faith-driven concept of Eretz Israel. Tel Aviv has replaced the agrarian, pioneering ethos of the early years with the temptations of high-tech, liberalism, and the global village, not anymore an isolated parochial Jewish village, as Jerusalem would have liked it. Tel Aviv drives for normalcy at any price is seen by Jerusalem as a shallow affair, criminally indifferent to the depth of Jewish memory and the lessons of Jewish history. The Israel of Jerusalem is that of the yearning for Jewish roots, a deep-rooted fear of the Arabs, and an unyielding distrust of the Gentiles and their international community. In our current flirtation with illiberal concepts, Israel's far-right coalition produced a Jerusalemite nation-state law that stands in stark contradiction with both Israel's 1948 Declaration of Independence and the 1992 constitutional law in the human dignity and liberty. This is a basic law, a constitutional law in effect, both of which recognize the full and unconditional individual rights of all, Jews and Arabs, in the Jewish and democratic state. A wide array of laws explicitly and implicitly define Israel as a Jewish state, a notion that represents a consensus in the international community as well. Not only does the 1947 UN partition plan define Israel as the state of the Jewish people, it also is a foundation of the peace process. Now, Israeli Arabs resigned themselves to the Jewish majority view as to the limits of their bearing on Israeli democracy, particularly with regard to what we call crucial national decisions. For example, in the highly sensitive Committee for Foreign Affairs and Security, Arabs are entitled to have a representative, and they were offered a seat, but they refused to sit and be part of the debates or deliberations on Israel's security. Now, not unlike the mushrooming, one of the reasons I'm trying to see why is the law necessary at all. One possibility is, as I say, that Netanyahu has been accumulating political capital by appealing to tribal instincts and pitting groups against each other, which is a practice that many authoritarian leaders in democracies today exercise, manipulated into perceptions of physical and demographic insecurity. He put identity first and democracy second. Now, conspicuously, the new law was enacted when the process of Arab integration, this is something that many people that criticize Israel from outside are not aware of. The new law was enacted when the process of integration is progressive as never before. The 2017 Israel Democracy Institute Index of Arab-Israeli Relations, the last one, found that 80% speak fluent Hebrew. 77% are not interested in separation, and 80% support the two-state solution. The overwhelming majority agree to the following statement: when I look at the disturbances and instability in the Arab world, I feel that it is good that I live in Israel. So Professor Amal Jamal of Tel Aviv University studied the consistent rise in the number of Arab academics and the emergence of an Arab middle class and an increasingly empowered Arab civil society willing to fight government discriminatory policies. Now, why then legislate such an unnecessary law? In my view, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that it is perhaps the Palestinians in the occupied territories that this law pretends to target. For the fear that Israeli Arabs may become a majority and change by democratic means Israel's Jewish character is totally unfounded. Jews can become a minority only when they annex the Palestinian occupied territories. With the two-state solution all but dead, giving preference to Israel's Jewish identity is the right answer to the fear of its expansionist policies, creating a one-state reality between the sea and the River Jordan, where Jews would be a minority. So in that sense, Netanyahu is the horseman of the Jewish apocalypse. He sees the potential. He sees the potential of the disappearance of a Jewish majority, and he tries to avert the catastrophe by creating this law that defines under all conditions Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, and leaves aside, brushes aside the equality element that appears in the Declaration of Independence and in a wide array of other laws. Well, of course, there is also a shift to more assertive religiosity in wider political sectors in Israel. One very brief reference to what is going on in the Arab world, and then one brief paragraph to sum up. The same Arab world that has put Israel in the dock of the Tribunal of World Opinion, arguing that religion is not a legitimate basis for statehood, is not exactly a monument to religious and ethnic diversity either. The Middle East is experiencing today the collapse of the notion that Arab states can accommodate religiously and ethnically diverse societies. Out of the Arab Spring's turmoil, not only the yearning for the dignity of the individual, but also the long-simmering frustration of oppressed minorities unfolded as if it were a second phase of the decolonization process. Arab states are imploding under the weight of the revolt of peoples and tribes held together only by the yoke of a dictator seeking to impose unity on multi-ethnic societies. The Arab Spring let loose the ambitions of ethnic and religious groups to redress the politico-ethnic map of the region. And there are so many differences. Look at Bahrain, is a potential volcano between the ruling minority and the Shia majority. Jordan is a precarious equilibrium in times of peace, let alone if there are troubles, if we go into times of trouble. Look at Yemen. Yemen is disintegrating. It was a merger of two states in the first place, and you could never see the primary units of its social structure, the tribe, accept the sovereign state. Today, the Houthi challenge is tearing apart what remains of a united Yemen. Look at Syria, look at Lebanon. I mean, the Arab world has shown that it is incapable of digesting multi-ethnicity, multi-religiosity, multi-religion, and multi-ethnicity. Now, the fact that this is happening might perhaps explain in a way why the Israeli right has the capacity to influence the electorate with its arguments, because when Arab states are melting down throughout the region, when Netanyahu might have a case when he says, is this such a brilliant idea to create another Arab state that might melt down just as all the others are melting down. So we don't know where things will evolve. As Xu Enlai, the Chinese leader, said of the impact of the French Revolution, it is too early to say. The Chinese have a different concept of time, and we still will have to see what would be the future. Look at the case of Sudan. South Sudan is Christian, North Sudan is Muslim, Black Africa starts in the borderline between South and North. Eventually, the Christian South seceded under the impact of a civil war with 2 million victims. Now, is this what is waiting for in the future for Arab countries? I don't know. This is why I say it is too early to say. My last reflections. We are, and this is no secret to anybody, living in times of upheaval with the fragility of the liberal global order, the rise of white nationalism, the melting down of states throughout an Arab world that is in the middle of a civilization crisis. All these give us a sense of loss of compass, loss of sense of direction. Now, due to the evident exhaustion of this Western-inspired, liberal, universalist value system, Henry Kissinger's recipe in his latest book, World Order, of a return to the Westphalian system based on the primacy and inviolability of the nation state, is anyway gaining ground by its own weight. But nationalist narcissism, we know, and he knows better than many, has always been a potent root of war. So it is no less than an existential test for the liberal West to devise a new socio-economic deal, since my argument was that it's not only a cultural alienation between the liberal elite and the mass of the people, but there is a sub-economic structure that can explain this rift, this widening rift. So there is a need to devise a new socio-economic deal based on a determined fight to eliminate or to brutally reduce poverty, real reduction of inequalities. Nobody believes that you can reconcile full quality or equality with freedom. History has shown that once you try to create that kind of utopia, you end in a gulag. So that's not the idea. The idea is not to have these totally unacceptable and obscene disparities. Governments in the West, particularly in the in Europe, are opening themselves to having today again trade unions to defend the rights of workers, the recovery of the welfare state, a truly progressive tax system, such that I guess the former CEO of Starbucks and presidential pretender might not be too happy with. And the new social contract adapted to the age of automation. By now, we should be wise enough to assume that the market itself is not the cure for all diseases. It is a sad truth that a decade after the biggest crisis in living memory, it is practically business as usual. It is also critical to understand that nationalism is, as such, has never been, is not and has never been intrinsically a power for evil. No way. On the contrary, it was a vehicle to the liberation of groups and the dignity of the individual. This is the way nationalism started. What is called for now is a return to responsible nationalism and to the idea that the main responsibility of governments is the well-being of their citizens, not an abstract concept of global good in which the super rich launder their conscience after having surrendered their loyalty to the concrete place. It is also critical that we strike a balance between universal values and people's ever-enduring ties of belonging and nationhood. Ignoring the givens of human nature, with all the progress in technology, with all NASA and Silicon Valley, and Tel Aviv is also a sort of Silicon Valley. Human character hasn't changed. It's the same exactly. It doesn't change. It is there. It is a fact that needs to be taken into consideration. So ignoring the givens of human nature, communal attachments and traditions, and haughtily repudiating them has proved to be a recipe for disaster. Thank you.